Welcome to Fos, where we are creating space for each person to find hope, beauty, and purpose in the story of Jesus, as well as their place in it. Recently, we've been talking about the idea of table and table settings. We've been able to focus on what does it look like when we bring the new together, when we invite, we include, and we invest in. And a question came up about anxieties, because we wanted to create a multi-path way to the table, to the community. And we said we want to make it anxious-free. So then a question was asked, when two people show up as their authentic selves, not putting on airs, and it creates anxiety for both parties, what happens then? Do we ignore it? Do we insist everyone simply sits in the tension? Like, what does it look like to move forward? This brought me back to a pivotal moment in my own development. Years ago, I was standing in line with two couples who were about 25 years older than me. They're sort of pseudo-parent figures, the aunts and uncles that aren't really related to you, but they help raise you. Both couples were in love, enjoyed showing affection, even in public, which was a little bit cringe for me. But this night, I was going to be watching their kids because this night was date night. One of the couples started making larger-than-life boasts. The kids better have earplugs because, tonight's going to be wild, as he lovingly grabs his wife and makes her blush. Both couples laughed, and I cringed because, again, these boasts were like hearing my own parents talk about sex, and nobody wants that. Just as they were going into round 2 of these kind of jokes, a woman standing in front of us got a little bit tense. She quickly looks around and then grabs her girlfriend's hand next to her, pulled her in for a chaste 2-second kiss. Then immediately they create some space and distance from each other again. The jovial melody of the stories and the jokes being told around me abruptly stop. It was like listening to live music when suddenly backfeed goes through the mic and everyone has tension. The music is dead, the sound is ruined. And answers to a moment of silence while you try to adjust. But the silence was broken when one of the men said, "I don't mind those kind of people, but why do they always have to shove it down our throats? Why do they always have to try to put it in our face?" And he said this without even a hint of irony. He has spent the last 15 minutes flirting, sexually joking, while holding on to his partner without a single concern for who was around. Without a single thought of who could overhear or who could see and what would the consequences be, because he assumed a right not only to be able to show up as he is, but for other people to honor it as well. In that moment, there were two sets of anxious people, both showing up as their true selves. One experienced the anxiety of the inherited. He talked about traditional marriage, what is right, and then points to history and nature as he reads and said, see, all things point to this one truth, to this one way of being. How could they violate? While the other experienced the anxiety of being present. They wanted to be themselves and anxiously had to look around to judge whether it was safe to do so. They risked showing up as themselves, and in doing so, they had the anxiety of saying, is this going to cost us something just to be us? As luck would have it, that is precisely the kind of question driving the letter of 1 Corinthians. See, often we start with the Gospels, but if you really want to see what the nascent church, what the first years were like, 1 Corinthians is one of our first letters of the dialogue in the church when they're trying to say, what do we do now? There's a large inclusio, which means a closed section, formed using the Passover in chapter 5. And then the Eucharist in 11. It says in 5:7-8, for Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Therefore, let's celebrate the feast, not with the old inherited leaven, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And in 11, Paul speaks of Christ's table and the Lord's Supper or communion. This is one large rhetorical section, developing a way of thinking that would create trouble for those comfortable with their position at the table as it was inherited, for those who see themselves as in charge, strong, and the right ones to rule. And it breaks down to a notion of the strong and the weak. The strong were those who often defaulted to the inherited, They're not called strong, meaning spiritually mature. Rather, it comes out of Greek rhetoric. The strong, the wise, the wealthy were ways of speaking of the ruling class of the city, of the elite, those who were expected to make decisions, set boundaries. The few were always expected to rule over the city, their household, and then their table. And they saw it as connected circles. To upset the table would then upset the household, and that could affect the ruling of the city. So when Paul ends this with Christ's table, he's actually flipping into reversing. If we can destabilize the table, maybe we can readjust some of the household, and that could possibly affect the way the whole city is ran. The weak were everyone else. Women, the enslaved, non-citizens, and all those expected to fall in line to the ideal male ruler head of house. As it walks through, I just want to point out a couple of the rhetoric pieces building through this section. Chapter 6 raises questions about legal disputes and lawsuits. Now, in this time, legal disputes would be just drawn out of some of the affluent people who would sit as judges over. They didn't have quite the established systems now when we think we just go to a court of law. So the rich would have an inherent advantage because these times businesses were done by families. So for one person to come in, if he's well connected, often they would rule in his favor because who cares if you upset the peons? And Paul says in 6 that the elite, the rich, those with social affluence to capitalize on these kind of lawsuits, must give up their rights to public trial and accept the judgment of the community, which means this is an inter-community conflict, a conflict where some of the poor and the powerless are challenging the elite and the rich to say, you have not done right by us. It also means that within these communities that the poor, the enslaved, and the powerless have voice. And those who are the strong must suffer loss to elevate the powerless to a place of equal. Then we step into chapter 7, where Paul says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of weakness, because of inherent temptation, I make this concession to you. Not a command, but a concession, to let each one have a partner. And then he goes on to say, if anyone thinks that he is acting dishonorably towards his virgin, so that would mean probably his daughter, someone that he has power over, let him do what he wishes. He is not sinning to let them get married. So Paul agrees with the strong. He agrees it is not good to touch a woman, that the ideal is a sexlessness. But the strong were to create room for those who they saw as morally weak, those who could be given to temptation, that they'd be tempted by desire and illicit sex. So he went against the ideal to make a concession for marriage. And the concession goes even farther when he says, if his virgin, so his daughter, wants to marry, then let her desire be honored. Women were considered morally weak, flexible, given to too much influence at the time. They thought the ideal was the untouchable male, that the male was the one in full control. So when Paul goes as far as to say, you know what, the desires of the weak actually should affect the standards set by the elite males, he's calling the strong male to delimit himself in order for the daughter's desires to set the course forward. Let her get married. This same logic is repeated each chapter. The strong are called to hold space open at the table for the weak. The strong would see this as profaning their sacred space. They would be anxious and have tradition, power, and rights on their side. But they must suffer the loss, exist in their own anxiety to make room for the expanding table of Christ. Now coming into our section in chapter 11, where we get to talk about the Eucharist and the table and the fellowship. Paul goes, I do not praise you because you come together not for the betterment of everyone, but for the worse. When you come together, it is not Christ's table, because each one of the strong and the elite take their own supper first, and others go hungry while some get drunk. Some are taking everything they have a right to because they have power and affluence. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? And remember, the poor don't. The servants don't. They exist in other people's houses. So this is only spoken to the masters. Do you despise the people of God and shame those who have nothing? The one eating and drinking judgment on himself is the one who eats and drinks in excess without consideration for the body, for those sitting around the table, for all the gathered who would have identity with Christ. And he goes on to say, not delimiting the strong for the inclusion of the weak, not delimiting the ones you think should, the expected, to make sure that the unexpected have room to experience the community, is the reason the community is under discipline by God. So then, when you come together to eat, wait for each other. Paul sees the replication of the power structures in society coming into the table of Christ as one of the reasons God is bringing judgment. And it's no wonder we see some decline and some trouble within the churches in North America. We have spent so much trying to garner favor with political structures to try to sit over people's tables that we forgot that we're called to humble ourselves to sit at tables and to elevate the marginalized and the powerless to be equals at the tables, not to rule over. This command in 30, where it says to wait, only puts boundaries on the elite, the masters and heads of household. The servants, the enslaved, and the poor do not have control of their days or their bodies. They can only come when their labors are complete. For the masters of the house, where everyone is gathering in that moment, they must wait until their servants and the enslaved finish preparing the meal that everyone's going to eat. So that the servants and the enslaved, those who would be seen beneath, not fully human, not having full rights, would come to a full table. When the expected would say that the masters eat their fill, and then everyone else comes in for the scraps. We've spent so many years trying to make everyone equal at the foot of the cross to create a universal experience for all, that we forgot that the demands of Christ's table are not the same for all. Those who have an assumed right to speak, who see themselves as guarding, gatekeepers, knowers, and protectors of the inherited faith, must embrace the anxiety of being present instead of being over. It is up to them to create room and sit in their own anxiety so other people can be fully present. Those whose place is tentative, who need permission to speak up, who know being honest will likely have them placed at the edges of the community, they will place faith in the community by becoming fully present and embracing the anxiety of trusting and being present within the community at the table. Salvation for the masters is humility that takes them from over the table to sitting with around the table. Salvation for the marginalized is elevating themselves so that they take up space at the table rather than trying to earn it by serving. In this way, Christ's table becomes a beautiful provocation as it embraces good and necessary trouble for everyone to be present. As Barbara Brown Taylor said, the only clear lines I draw these days is this: when my religion tries to come between me and my neighbor, I will choose my neighbor. The self-counseling feature of my religion is one of the things I like best about it. Jesus never commanded me to love my religion, only the people around the table. So now getting back to the standing in line at the deli in the first story, where we left two groups in tension about being authentically present. Following Paul's logic through Corinthians, when we're at Christ's table, whose anxiety do we stand with when two groups show up authentically and it creates angst with each other? Do we stand with the anxiety of the inherited or the anxiety of being present? I believe Corinthians calls us to move from the anxiety of the inherited or the expected in order to create room for the young couple's fearful and chaste kiss as they risk to embody and embrace the anxiety of being fully present. That we move towards the authentic, true expression of people. And this is the supreme religious challenge, says Jonathan Sacks. It is to see God's image in one who is not our image. So if we sit over the table, The challenge for us is to lower ourselves, to let go of control, to be present at the table. If you see your space at the table not protected, if you're not sure if you actually have it, but you think you have to earn it, then the call of Christ and challenge for you is to be brave enough to lean into your anxiety, to be present at the table. And the experience of being lowered and being raised will find a new generative potential to a community we could not see coming.